Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Hurley. With me are board members Mike Brown and Ted Daver. Together, the three of us comprise the Zoning Board of Appeals for the purposes of considering the application under General Laws Chapter 40B with respect to the property at 648 Canton Avenue here in Milton. Just to recap where we've been so far, and then I'll quickly introduce what we have in mind for this evening. The idea going forward was that we would open with the applicants and the applicants' experts, and that they would sort of give us an overview of the project without getting into really great detail, because we thought that would come later. Armed with that information, we then turned to, and in the process of considering peer review people who have been engaged by the town to assist in the process. We didn't pick the peer reviewers. They don't work for us. We don't control them. We just get the information from them just as you do. We had our traffic engineer last week who spoke. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to stick around long enough to take all the questions that I'm sure some people had. That was the traffic aspect of this. Tonight, we're going to do site civil. One of the representatives from Tetra Tech is going to go through what was a fairly detailed report that they prepared, and that I know I had a chance to read through today. After we do Tetra Tech tonight, we'll move on to glasses on here. We'll move on to the final person, and that's the design review peer reviewer. That's Davis Square Architects. And those were the three peer reviewers that were engaged by the town: site civil, design, and traffic. And this is the second one this evening. So my hope tonight is that the Tetra Tech representative will go through the written report and answer questions from board members and others. Fairly detailed report. As I said, it covers a lot of ground, and I'm sure it will generate lots of questions when they go through each aspect of it. So that's the plan. Just with respect to the peer review, just to look a little bit further into the future. After we finish the peer review, the idea is that the town, through its representatives, would present whatever information they wanted to bring to bear on the subject of this application. And those folks would also be subject to questioning from both representatives of the developer as well as town residents or any other interested persons who have questions about any of the information that's been provided. When we finish with the town portion of the presentation, we will turn to the neighbors, to the public generally. One group of neighbors is led by Mr. Corcoran, who has already played an active role in this process. I'm sure he will play an active role when we get to that point. He advises that they have several experts who will also testify in the course of the presentation. And then, of course, in that aspect of the hearing, the members of the board will look to hear from members of the public who have their own thoughts and views with respect to this application. Once we get all of that information process completed, the idea then is that the board, having received all the information, will speak largely to the developer in terms of considerations and issues that the board may have based on all the information that's presented. And the idea would be that the developer would then respond in whatever way they thought appropriate, including but not limited to perhaps going back and looking at certain aspects of the proposal and perhaps coming up with changes. So that's the process that we see as it would unfold. Obviously, ultimately, when we finish all this information gathering, sharing of ideas, the burden will fall on the board to make a decision with respect to the project, with respect to any conditions that we might consider and include any decision that we ultimately reach. So that's sort of a quick précis of where we've been and where we're going in this process. And with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to the experts.
Me?
So is someone here from Tetra Tech?
I am. This is Sean Reardon from Tetra Tech.
Hi, Sean. Welcome to the Board of Appeals.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm not usually referred to as an expert, especially at home where I am right now.
Okay.
So probably the easiest thing to do is just go right into my letter. As the chair mentioned, we were engaged by the Zoning Board of Appeals to look at principally civil engineering issues, including stormwater, utilities, parking, constructibility, and ancillary wetland impacts as well. We issued a letter late last week that had about 30 comments encompassing the complete range of issues. But I think most of those comments boil down to probably 3, maybe 4 principal concerns. First, and probably the most important, is groundwater has been a pretty constant issue that the neighbors have brought up and that people have always mentioned to me, and is going to be a particular challenge on this project because, as the test pits show, they're very shallow groundwater on the site. But almost no information was provided on how the contractor or how the developer plans to deal with that groundwater. For example, they have, I think, 5 or 4 detention basins, all of which are completely in groundwater. And the design that they show doesn't do anything to keep the groundwater out. So those wouldn't function properly. The garage is at least 10 feet below what we expect the groundwater table to be at the far south end. Obviously that would have to be dealt in some way. And what's particularly complicated is that, well, you've got a stream right next door within less than 100 feet, maybe 80 feet or so, that if you pull all the groundwater out to dewater around the garage, well, then you're in all likelihood going to have some impacts to that stream. So really, we were surprised to see that there was almost no information on how the applicant plans on managing groundwater. And if they don't plan on managing groundwater, then a lot of the measures that they propose for stormwater control won't work. So that's one thing that we would look to see a lot more information on next time.
Can I just stop you for a second?
Sure.
What are the consequences that flow from a problem with groundwater? How does that manifest itself?
Flooding. So well, it impacts things in different ways. Our principal concern is, in order to manage stormwater from the site, because they have such a high amount of impervious area on such a small site, they have a big burden to deal with the extra stormwater that's going to come off of it. In this case, I have to hand it to the application material were really well done, very professionally done, very well organized. So I had a very easy time wading my way through it. So that was extremely helpful. But their plan requires storage vessels below the ground. The vessels are there to hold water that comes off of the paved surfaces in the roof of the building. If those are in groundwater and there's no means of keeping the groundwater out of those vessels, then that volume is filled with, that space is already filled with other water. So it doesn't really achieve the objective for what it's modeled to do. The garage a little bit different. So if you have water that's around the garage and finding its way into the floor of the garage, the floor of the garage is typically drained to sewer because the flow coming out of a garage can't go to stormwater. It needs to go to the sewer system. If you have groundwater infiltrating into the garage and getting into the sewer system, that's a violation. You're not allowed to discharge groundwater to the sewer system. So there's a whole host of other issues that all depend on basically what the function of the different systems are intended to do.
Okay, thank you for that.
And then one other big thing too is if you don't do something to relieve the groundwater, what it'll do is it'll push up on the floor of the garage. So as you know, I mean, everything floats to a certain extent. If there's water pressure underneath the slab of the garage that's not relieved, then it'll make the garage floor heave. The second more critical concern is there's what's called the Massachusetts Stormwater Standards, that are the rules by which civil engineers design drainage systems and runoff from a site to meet certain standards. There's a standard called Standard 3, which requires you to replace lost annual recharge to groundwater, which is kind of ironic in this situation, but it's a standard nonetheless. So the idea being that if you're converting a large site that's principally pervious surface like grass or dirt into something that's impervious, and with a drainage system, the idea is that, well, all that water that used to get into the ground, you're not letting getting into the ground anymore. So the standards require you to maintain sort of a minimum recharge requirement. In this case, admittedly, given the issues at the site and the issues in the neighborhood, the applicant the applicant's engineer has said that, yeah, it's not such a great idea to put that water back in the ground given all the groundwater issues. That being said, I'm not aware of any relief in the standards that allow you to sort of say, for practicality purposes, not meet the standard. So we'd have to get some more information from the applicant about how that works. But as things currently stand right now, they haven't done anything to re-infiltrate lost groundwater recharge due to the impervious surfaces. And the reason that's a big concern for us is, again, because of the high groundwater table, there's not a whole lot of options for introducing that recharge on the site. And then the last major concern we have is, again, a function of density. The site's been laid out real efficiently, but big rectangle in the middle of the site surrounded by a loop roadway doesn't leave any real room on the sides or in the back. Everything else that's not occupied by development is supposedly going to be trees that are left in place. Big challenge there is doesn't leave any room to manage construction. So we're surprised not to see anything that spoke to the issues that I think a lot of people are going to be concerned about is how any impacts from construction might spill out into the neighborhood. For example, we don't know where trailers are going to go, where materials are going to be staged, how stormwater is going to be managed during construction. All those things that are tough on even a normal site only get even more difficult on a site that sort of pushes the outer envelope of density. And then probably the last thing, which is more of an emotional thing on our side, is there's some pretty amazing beech trees on the site. There's a 72-inch beech tree that looks like it could be in a location that could potentially be saved. And those size beech trees you don't see very often, and it would be awesome if they could do something to protect that. The other issues we have documented are more, I think, you usually fall out in the subset of the three I just mentioned, and might be more technical in nature, but everything sort of fits under those three categories we just mentioned.
Anyone have any questions so far? Beverly, any questions showing up? Any people raising their hands?
There are none, no.
Mr. Chair, I have two, but I can wait until Mr. Reardon has finished his initial presentation.
Okay. Well, then why don't you ask them now? I mean.
Okay. And they sort of relate to the bigger issues. The first is that there were only 6 test pits taken on the site. 3 in September during a dry season, 3 in a wet in February. 2 of them, test pits number 3 and 4, are next door to each other. And they show an 8-foot differential in stormwater levels. Do you think it's appropriate that we get additional test pits spread across the site so we know more about the makeup of the site and the flow of groundwater? And
Without question. Yeah.
Do you think it's appropriate to install something like some monitoring wells or pressure transducers to evaluate soils and measure groundwater levels over the next 4 to 8 weeks?
All of that data is absolutely valuable, particularly given how sensitive and how close the stream is. So that would be great information to have. I would say at a minimum, we'd need to distribute some test pits across the site, get some confirmation on those estimated seasonal high groundwater measurements and work based on that.
Yeah, it looks like only three test pits taken in February are closer to Canton Avenue. None of them are in the area that's subject to the construction of the garage.
Correct.
And yet there's a proposed system underneath the floor of the garage. So there's no information there about the flow of groundwater through the portion of the large portion of the site that's subject to this, sort of, I guess, bathtub, if you would, to be installed.
Yeah, that's a good way to characterize the garage, because that's in fact what it would be, is sort of a bathtub.
Okay.
And I'd add that it's going to be important to get some information along the property line to the west, because of how proximate that stream is. And the stream has been classified, I believe, as an intermittent stream. So it's got some pretty unique characteristics and pretty sensitive characteristics that it can be impacted pretty significantly by dewatering on a site adjacent to it.
Right. That is itself a groundwater standard. It has to be under the DEP regs. Is that correct? I think it's Stormwater 4, Regulation 4, or Standard 4.
For the recharge to groundwater?
For the protection of a wetland.
Correct.
Right. So they have to maintain flow of groundwater to the wetland. They can't draw groundwater away from the wetland and then impact the quality of the wetland going forward. Correct.
And also you bring up a good point, because they're doing work within 100 feet of a resource area. They're subject to jurisdiction under the Wetlands Protection Act. So there's a whole other host of performance standards that come in that aren't just related to stormwater.
Right. My second major question, Mr. Chair, if I may, is that in comment number 22, you raised the issue whether the town's water and sewer systems are capable of handling the water and sewer demands from a project of this scale. And you suggest that the engineer should prepare a memorandum demonstrating the ability of the systems to provide these services. In a similar fashion, Milton is operating under an MS4 permit from DEP and EPA relative to stormwater impacts on waters of the Commonwealth. In fact, we now have a annual stormwater charge that's allocated to every property owner in town that is to compensate for some of the impacts of stormwater on the state level. But this is a federal standard that can't be waived by a local decision. Given the fact that the development proposes to discharge stormwater directly into the town's drain system, do you think it's appropriate that the engineer should file a similar report relative to the drain system's ability to receive groundwater, given its condition and capacity, and as well as with respect to treatment of groundwater before it enters, but when it leaves the site and before it enters the system?
I don't know if we need a separate report. There's a stormwater report that gets issued as part of the drainage design that should cover all those same issues. So to meet standard, I think it's number 2, that you can't discharge post-development runoff at any higher rate than pre-development runoff. That would all speak to the issues that you just talked about. There's also requirements for discharge of water quality. So all of those things would be handled as a subset under the stormwater management report, and we'd look to have all those questions answered.
Okay, and you know that are you aware that the town's drain system ties directly to the Pine Tree Brook, which flows directly to the Neponset River, and so they are regulated wetland waterways under this MS4 permit.
Correct. And as a contributor to the town's system, the town can regulate all the connections to their MS4. So all of those things will need to be addressed.
Okay.
On the water and sewer, just real quick on that, the reason that gets in by itself is because there's no other mechanism to require that. Like the stormwater design is usually a good mechanism for handling the issues you described. But it's important to note that when original systems are designed, that the municipal systems, they're usually basing their system design on the zoning. So they're not, when they laid out the water system or initially laid out the sewer system, I don't think anybody was anticipating 124 units on this particular piece of property. So what we do is we ask the applicant to just prepare a memo that substantiates why that the anticipated loads from the new facility, even though they're well outside of what would have possibly been forecasted under the original design of the municipal system, just prove to us and give something to the board that you can use as factual basis for reaching a conclusion. Otherwise, we're just left with, okay, we've got a project that's substantially beyond any density that would have ever been forecasted for this particular site without any record of whether the downstream systems or the supplying systems can support it.
Well, then in just in a sort of a similar vein, this town's drain system was installed in Canton Avenue decades ago. Likely not sized to current storm standards. Do you think it'd be appropriate that at least the developer would evaluate the capacity of the system to handle this volume, the proposed volume of stormwater coming off of this site? We're going to 2.5 acres of new impervious surface.
Well, certainly if there are known issues within the system that they're relying on to take their water, they're going to need to address that. What's, I think, particularly interesting about this site is because of the groundwater table and the assumption at this point that there's going to have to be a fair amount of dewatering. That puts a totally new burden on the drainage system that didn't exist prior. So we'd be particularly sensitive about those kind of changes because those can get overlooked and the potential impacts of those kind of discharges can get overlooked. Compliance with the standards where they have to figure out how to hold the water on their site so that they don't discharge at any higher rate than pre-development sort of addresses a lot of our concerns about overtaxing the system during a regular storm. But that doesn't say that if the system downstream has problems already, they can't just unilaterally rely on that system to solve their needs. So if there are known issues with the system, they're going to have to address that in some way.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have at this time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
We have two. Kathleen O'Donnell first.
Okay, thank you. Good
Kathleen?
evening, Kathleen.
Good evening. How are you?
Well,
I just had a quick question, Mr. Reardon. I noticed in the letter that you said that the stormwater system under the building is permissible. But I'm wondering that given the comments that you've made about the groundwater level and the issue of all the water on the site, and I've walked it myself, is that how could a stormwater system in the garage actually work with all the groundwater that you're having to deal with?
Yeah, permissible was a word choice on purpose. We had a similar system that was proposed on the Blue Hill Ave 40.
Yeah, right.
The big difference is in that system, it was an infiltrating system. So that system was designed to allow water to drain out of it. And when you have that kind of a system, there are all sorts of offset requirements in the standard that couldn't be met. So for example, there's a 20 or 30 foot offset from foundations that couldn't be met. In this case, the vessel below the groundwater, the garage floor slab is being modeled as just a storage vessel. There are no such offsets in those kind of things. So you can put a big tank under the slab of your floor and use that for storing stormwater. Do it in Boston quite often. But it brings in all those other issues that you mentioned, which is, okay, yeah, you can do it, but now you've got to figure out, okay, how you're dealing with groundwater, how you're going to make sure groundwater doesn't infiltrate into that storage. How do you make sure all that storage is available when the storm comes? So we did touch on some of those issues, but it's not it's not precluded from being used in that way under the stormwater management standards.
Thank you.
Ken Roach?
Yes, hi, this is Kenny Roach, live on Holmes Lane. Just wanted to touch base on a couple things. Mr. Reardon got to a few of them, but I guess one of the questions was, has there been any considerations for the dewatering for purposes of constructability? And, you know, as he mentioned, there are a lot of logistical issues with the site, with the amount of space the proposed project's taking up, and with, you know, on-site parking and trailers and storages and all that stuff. You know, adding a dewatering system into the mix to be able to handle the groundwater that is assumed at this project, you know, a frac tank of that could be anywhere from 60, 70 feet long and however wide, and incorporating all that stuff into a CMP plan to show how the site is actually going to be possible to build on.
Well, I mean, either that or they've got bad records, and I've never heard of PayPal sending out credit cards or something like that.
Kathleen
has an
O'Donnell,
issue.
mute yourself, please.
So yeah, that was one question, just how, you know, has there been any thought into the logistical challenges of dewatering and the costs that are associated with the construction dewatering during construction, and especially during the winter, and costs can get pretty substantial. And with the groundwater being at the elevations it's at, I would assume it would be required for the life of the project, which would be anywhere from 18 to 22 months long project, and dewatering for that whole duration. And again, it was touched upon, but how that taxes the town system, as I don't think it would be able to be recharged on site without causing issues to abutters. So just a question that would be nice to see how that's all incorporated into the site CMP plan when that is presented. And I had one more question while I'm on. Oh, go ahead.
So I
Sorry.
agree with you, Ken, and also keep in mind, so you've got two sources of water during construction that need space to manage. One is, like you mentioned, obviously dewatering is going to be a big part of whatever they do. They're going to need to have space on site to make sure that water is free of sediments before it's discharged to the drainage system under a permit. But they also need to, under just to manage runoff from a disturbed site. So if you can imagine, 80% of this site is going to be disturbed during construction. The site is bigger than an acre, so it's going to require a permit, what's called a NIPDES permit for managing construction runoff. And it requires a certain amount of space and volume be created for every square foot of area that you disturb. The only way to meet that requirement is you need space on site. So there's two sources of water that they have to address, which is the dewatering, that's the pulling, where we pull the groundwater up and out so that they can work. And two is that when and if it rains, that they're not allowing runoff from a disturbed site to just flow to the street and get into the system that way. All of which require space. And we haven't really seen any information addressing how they plan on handling that.
Thank you. One last question, and I understand it's early on in the process and planning and drawings and all that stuff, but based on the proposed project and the limits of its work within the footprint of the building, I would assume it would be necessary to install some sort of SOE system, supportive earth system, to accomplish excavating the foundation, especially in the south or the rear of the site. And with that comes its own issues, and assuming based on one of the 6 borings, there was ledge found relatively shallow. I think it's 6 or 8 feet I'm sure that's not the only spot. When you start hitting ledge when driving piles or sheets or however it's going to be managed to retain the earth to be able to excavate for the building foundation, is there thoughts on how it would be handled if ledge is encountered at a point that has to be addressed? Is it going to be hammered? Is it going to be blasted, etc.?
I didn't see anything related to removal of ledge. The thing about ledge is if there is ledge, it's hard to remove certainly, but it does mean your supportive excavation is a little bit easier because there's no sliding soils. But you bring up a really good point because there's very limited space on either side of the building between the building and the property line. I presume the fire department's going to require them to maintain a clear path around the building during construction, which leaves very little space between the building foundation and what would be required to maintain fire access in which to do your supportive excavation. So yeah, as we got further on in the process, in some of the other issues sort of work their way through, we'd certainly be looking for some information on that as well.
Thank you.
Beverly, anyone else?
There are, nope.
Ned, did you have anything further you wanted to ask?
No, I'm all set at this time. Thank you, Mr. Hurley.
How about my other board members, Mr. Brown or Mr. Dave, or any questions for?
Not at this time, Mr. Chair.
I just asked because I'm curious. In paragraph number 24 of your letter, you refer to standard 3. Can you just explain to me what that's about?
So I referenced that a little bit earlier, where it's a standard that requires you to recharge groundwater from a developed site to approximate existing conditions. So it's an explicit standard that says you have to approximate annual recharge even after your development. And there's really, really strict rules for how you demonstrate compliance and no relief for it. What they've said is well, because there's so much issues with groundwater in the neighborhood, we're not going to recharge it. So that for all intents and purposes meets the standard. Our position is that doesn't meet the standard because you're not approximating annual recharge. That's going to require them to figure out a way to meet that standard, which presumably includes figuring out how to infiltrate a good deal of runoff from the site into the ground at the same time that they're trying to pull it out of the ground in another area. So you can see the sort of the catch-22 situation that they're in.
So that's a state requirement. That's not a local requirement.
Correct. And it's a requirement brought in because they are within jurisdiction of the Wetlands Protection Act. So it's a mandatory requirement under their wetlands issues.
There's one other question I had. Just hang on for a second. No, I guess that was the one question I have from what I read.
I have a quick question, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay.
Please, Mr. Dayrod, happy to hear from you.
Mr. Reardon, you were just saying a couple minutes ago that there's appears to be inadequate space between the building and the property line to both accommodate the access needed around the building for fire access and room for construction activities. Is that, am I stating that correctly? I mean, maybe not.
Maybe taking a little bit further than I took it.
Okay.
There's always extraordinary means that you can employ to do incredible things in tight locations.
Okay.
What I want to make sure people understand is that you really don't have 20 feet to work with because you have to keep that area clear for fire trucks. So it's easy to think that there's a lot more space than you actually have. In this case, they've got about, I think, 25 feet between the property line and the edge of the building, which in some cases is 10 feet below grade. There's a lot of things that have to be done within that 25 feet, all of which are competing for that space. I'm not saying they can't do it, but it's something that we need to be aware of, because the logical extension of that is, well, then they get into construction, get a little stressed for space, and they start creeping into the neighbor's property, or things start happening that you didn't expect to happen. These are all things that typically zoning takes care of, right? When you have zoning compliant projects, there's a lot of breathing room, a lot of space where these things normally get done, so they're not an issue for typical construction. But in situations like this, where there's allowances for pushing the outer envelope as far as it can go, we start creating these really stressful spaces around the building with a lot of competing interests, and we just want to make sure everybody's aware so that there's no surprises, that you don't go out there and find out there's just stockpiles all along the side of the building, and the fire department all of a sudden has a problem because they can't get through. We want to make sure all these things are vetted through this process so that the plan that's eventually approved is reasonably achievable with the expectations in mind.
Okay, and you're recommending that be provided through construction management plan? How that's going to be dealt with? Yeah.
Correct. Just basically prove to us that you've got control of these issues. So if you don't address them, we're going to ask, and then maybe it forces changes to the project that are sort of create more additional space to work in, and to simultaneously reduce the burden that you have to overcome.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question at present. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, we do have a few attendees with their hands up.
Please, I want to make sure we cover everyone that has a question tonight.
Yes, so Cheryl?
Thank you, Cheryl Tagayas. Mr. Reardon, there are several of your comments that I think seem related, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on them a bit. The first would be number 3, the stream being noted as intermittent on the ORAD. Could you just go explain that a little bit further? And then I'm curious about how that relates to comment number 8 with the proximity of the stream at 656 Canton Ave, and then also comment number 17, which relates to the stone wall at 656 Canton Ave. So they all seem to be tied together in terms of the proximity of that stream and the property line and the scope of work. So if you could get into a little more detail on that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So the first thing, let's take the stone wall. The stone wall is more of an issue related to, there's a physical marker there that marks the edge of the property line that extends a little bit onto both properties. You can't sort of use the 1 foot of the stone wall, the space in the 1 to 2 feet of the stone wall that's on the subject property without impacting the adjacent property. So we just want to make sure, again, to remind people of how tight construction is over in that area, and that, again, a lot of competing interests for the same space. The other issues you speak about have more to do with sort of the groundwater issues. Everything, if you think about it, everything's connected below grade by the groundwater. So the stream that you see on the property next door is somewhat related to the groundwater conditions on the site. I don't know if it's all stormwater runoff, but definitely I would expect that there's a connection between the hydraulic conditions on the adjacent property and the hydraulic conditions on the subject property, so that when you start pulling a bunch of water, say 10 feet of water out of the subject parcel, there's also going to be a drawdown of water on the adjacent parcels, because that's the way it works. It's that you don't draw down in a vertical regime. You draw down with a sort of, it gradually extends outward. The big issue that I speak about on the stream, I was a little uncertain. The plans call it stream an intermittent stream. And the reason I ask is there are 2 classifications for a stream. One is intermittent and one is perennial. If a stream is perennial, which means it flows all year round, it's now subject to the Rivers Protection Act, which makes that stream and the 200-foot area around it a resource area. If it's classified as intermittent, which it currently appears to be, it doesn't have that 200-foot resource area around it. And there are very, very strict performance standards that apply to the riverfront area. So what we noted was that we didn't see it specifically identified in the section of the ORAD where they usually list the different resource areas. Not to say that it's not clearly an intermittent stream, just we wanted some clarification on that because the regulatory burden, if it is a perennial stream, becomes much higher.
And then another question, I think that's somewhat related, would be your comment number 14 about snow storage areas. My understanding would be that when those are plowed, they can't melt directly into the stormwater system because there could be salts and other things contained within that plowing. Is that right? Or are there other kinds of conditions under which we would need to be concerned about snow melt into the stormwater system?
No, I don't. Well, stormwater is snow. It's just another version of stormwater. So it's absolutely permissible for your melting snow to go into your drainage system. The big challenge is space. Again, snow takes up a lot more room than rain does. And again, back to the concept of competing interests for the same space. If you've got to maintain a fire lane around the building and you've got to maintain exterior parking, in those parking areas and those fire lanes go right up against the property and on one side and right up against the building on another side, well, you have to start asking questions about, okay, well, practically, what are your plans for dealing with snow? Particularly when you're on a site that has limited space for the other needs. We need to have a documented understanding of what the plan is for how they're going to address the snow loads that come to the site.
Okay, and then one last question has to do with the tree removal and especially the large tree that you mentioned, or large trees. How might the removal of those trees and their root structures impact groundwater or other stormwater issues? We've run into this in other projects in Milton on the planning board where they've come back with stormwater redesign as being necessary after some removal of trees that weren't planned to be removed initially. Thank you.
Yep. So trees do a lot of different things. Trees, number one, reduce the amount of runoff coming off of a site. So if you lose a tree, that's a lot of additional water that runs off the site under the post-development condition. That needs to get managed. One of the things that people I think sometimes don't consider is that when you lose a tree, trees take up a lot of groundwater. So when you lose trees on a site, say take a site that's otherwise wooded and turn it into not wooded, you can plan on seeing a rise in groundwater on that site because you have these things that used to suck out a lot of water during the summer and the spring months suddenly aren't there. So what we would expect to see is a slight rise in groundwater attributable to the fact that you don't have that vegetation taking up so much groundwater.
Thank you. That's all for me for now. Thank you.
Hey, Denny. Chair, may I call on Denny Swenson?
Yes, please do.
Mr. Swenson? Can you unmute?
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, miss, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's Denny Swenson. I'm sorry, my husband's name may have come up on the screen, but I'm also a member of the planning board, as Cheryl and Kathleen are. I also had questions about the trees, and I wanted to refer to zoning bylaw section 4A, earth materials removal and deposit of fill. We, as a planning board, have gone to some lengths to update this bylaw with the approval of the zoning board chair, John Leonard, to add that there should be a plan. So if you look under section 1, we added a seventh bullet We need a plan showing the existing treescape in the area proposed for the removal of earth material and the treescape proposed after removal. So all trees with a caliper of 3 or more inches should be shown on that plan. At this point, I agree with Tom Palmer that to date, those filings aren't up to par. Also on the same bylaw, number 3, again, section 7, there should be further plans showing the existing treescape in the areas proposed for the deposit of fill and treescape proposed after fill. And I can provide this document with the highlighted changes, but I do hope that you take on board that the planning board has worked very hard to have the zoning board article sort of mirror what our planning board rules and regulations, section 5, statement of development effect, which I would also like to provide to you after the planning board has had their meeting, and also rules and regulations, section 7 and section 13, which is the scenic roads. Section 7 is planting space. Section 5 is definitive plan. I could go on and on, but I know you want to leave at some point tonight, but it's all about incorporating the protection of trees for the reasons that Sean Reardon was mentioning. It sounds like on this plan, at least 80% of the site would be cleared. It actually sounds like more, given the competing issues. And as Mr. Reardon stated, vegetation on a site can drink up to 20 to 30% of the water on the site. But on a wooded lot with these size trees, these big, old trees, especially the deep rooted ones, will absorb even more than that. So that will affect the stormwater plan. And there should be, like Mr. Reardon was saying, in the construction management plan, that should be taken into account. We on the planning board refer applicants to, and I will provide you with these documents as well. The International Society of Arboriculture has guidelines avoiding tree damage during construction, new tree planting guidelines, treatment of trees damaged by construction, and mature tree care. And I would suggest that these could be incorporated as a reference materials in the construction management plan. It's one of the most thoughtful guidelines we've come to in years of dealing with these issues. Here, Cheryl and Kathleen can attest to that. So I'll speak more when we're listening to Tom Palmer's report. And I can provide perhaps a bullet list if that would help you in your board. Please do let me know.
That would be very helpful if you could do that, Mrs. Swenson. And if you could also provide us with, you made reference to several rules and regulations of both the planning board and the zoning board. If you could at some point be sure that we get copies of those as well, it would be very helpful.
Okay, and for ease of your reading, because I know you have an awful lot of reading, could I highlight the documents, perhaps in a color, to bring forward the key points so that you can see it in context, but
anything that you think will make it easier for us to understand will be appreciated.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for your service. I know these nights can be late, and I really thank your thoughtful approach. Thank you.
Okay, Beverly, anyone
Yes,
else on?
yes. Robin O'Neill?
Good evening.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, or I can.
Great, thank you. My name's Robin O'Neill. I live at 30 Holmes Lane. I concerned Mr. Reardon about your number 7. You're saying plans show an existing driveway connection to Holmes Lane, but no indication as to whether to its disposition under the final plan. Given the proposed density, we recommend the project consider maintaining the entrance as an emergency access, including any necessary repair / maintenance of Holmes Lane. The entrance should be for an emergency use only and not open to general site traffic, which is great. However, coming out of that driveway or coming up Holmes Lane, there's no way a fire truck or of any size is going to make the turn. We're having a gas line put in right now, and the logistics of that alone with smaller vehicles is overwhelming for the lane. Never mind the fact my house sits 3 to 4 feet from the lane. And in any kind of increased traffic, particularly of large vehicles, would be a real detriment to not just my house, but to the entire neighborhood. And I think is a unacceptable impact onto our neighborhood as a whole. I understand the reason for it, because for the size of the project, you want another access. And I get that, but bringing it around Holmes Lane, there's no way a fire truck is going to make that turn without hitting my house. It's not feasible. So I wish you would, address that and see if there's another secondary access rather than using Holmes Lane. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like me to respond to that, Mr. Chairman?
Please, if you would, that would be great.
So our thought there was, principally one is we wanted to know what was going to happen to the existing driveway because we didn't see it addressed in any way on the plans. And we didn't want to presume that it was going away without seeing an indication as such. The thought process on our side was not that it would ever get used, but it's certainly something that's valuable to have if in fact anything ever happened that prevented access from the main entrance. So I think we could very well expect reasonably to 30 years from completion of a project like this to never have activated that entrance, but having it available should anything arise can potentially be life-saving. So I agree with you 1,000%. That's why we put in that they'd have to make upgrades or whatever repairs necessary to Holmes Lane as part of that. But it would make sense to have another means of access if it was ever needed. But again, it could very well likely never, ever be used.
Bond?
So Neil, was there something you wanted to add?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Am I still on?
Yes, you are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Once in 30 years doesn't make me feel a whole lot better. Now, odds are in 30 years, I probably won't be here. I'm in my 60s, but we need a better guarantee, quite frankly, that there's no heavy traffic or any kind, even once in 30 years. It's a private lane that we have to maintain. And I think it's an undue burden upon this street and neighborhood to have any access to our lane whatsoever. It just, I mean, as it is, the driveways are going to be coming within 30, 40 feet of the front of my house with lights coming in the front of my windows. But to have another burden, even if it's once in 30 years, the possibility of someone being able to come down our street, it can't handle it. There's got to be a better solution. Another driveway onto Canton Avenue, or maybe a project that doesn't need so much another access. But to me, it's just an undue burden for our neighborhood, and certainly in my property, to have any kind of a big machinery coming around that house. And again, I don't care if it's once in 5 minutes or once in 50 years. It's not right for the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Beth.
Good
Can you hear
evening,
me?
Beth.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. This is Elizabeth Janiga from 658 Canton Avenue. Thank you, Mr. Reardon, for your very thorough document that you provided. I did go through it all. For a layperson, I understood most of it, which is great. And your very thorough presentation, as well as your answering of the questions. I'm asking these questions out of my ignorance because I just want clarification because I don't know. You spoke about the wetlands. I am behind, I guess, 648 Canton Avenue. And I have one of the largest areas of wetlands, I think, in this area. You spoke about the brook being, or stream, creek, being an intermittent stream, brook, or creek. My question is what agency determines that, or professional person determines that it's intermittent, simply because I don't know. So that's my first question. And the second is, there is a stream adjacent to that property that is proposed, or that the applicant has proposed at 648. But does that brook, stream, or creek that is adjacent to that property, does that continue back into the homes further down on the private drive that comes off Canton Avenue, which is Mergewood Lane? And I ask because I have not only the wetlands, but there's brooks back here. I say brooks plural. It's my assumption was it's one brook that's weaving and interweaving, but I don't know. So when you look at the impact for the wetlands and you're looking at the adjacent property, is it also looking at those brooks that go back into the properties that are a little beyond that? And Mr. Corcoran raised the issue about, the impact that they could have on basically draining wetlands and changing the wetlands. So I guess my second question is simply, has it been looked at, that brook that's adjacent to 648, does that continue back into the properties down to Mergewood Lane? And is all of those streams that we have back here, are all of them interconnected?
So let's take the first question first, which is who determines whether it's intermittent? So that's a process that the Milton Conservation Commission, or if appealed, the DEP would make. And there's a process called an ANRAD process, which is an abbreviated notice of resource area delineation, which I believe the project did in 2020. They submitted a plan to the Conservation Commission documenting the wetlands on the adjacent site so that they could understand what the limits of those resource areas are. So in that process, presumably the Milton Conservation Commission determined that it was an intermittent stream. Now, the reason I'm curious is because of exactly what you describe. Tim Zerwinski gave me a bunch of the neighbors' comments, and I read through all of them, and I plotted them all on a map, and I started looking at the grading in and around your homes. And what surprised me is that there's not and I could be wrong, I was just looking at maps, but it seems like there's a high point not too far behind the project site. In other words, water sort of goes in the opposite direction once you get back towards your property a little bit. And the wetland near you is on the other side of that high point, which to me struck me as kind of odd, because it seems like all of these wetland systems are tied together by the groundwater table. Because you wouldn't have so much concentration of flow if it were just a small little area of upland area that's draining off to the stream. So that's what made me think that maybe the stream was a little bit more groundwater fed than perhaps we might otherwise think. The good news on that is I think a lot of the homes that are on the other side of that high point aren't necessarily in the path of the stormwater from this site. But to your point, we need to understand a little bit more about what the groundwater table is doing to see what in fact is connected. But my sense is that all of these wetlands in and around this area are somewhat interconnected. Whether or not any activity on this project site could impact those wetlands further away, I'm a little less concerned that those wetlands would be impacted than I am about the one right next door.
How does one determine if the wetlands that are a little further away will be impacted?
Not easily. And it starts with, to Mr. Corcoran's point, is compiling some data on groundwater so we understand what's out there so that we can better understand what potentially is at risk. And then through answering some of the questions that we've posed, what I asked for is I asked for a little bit of the background for how it was determined that it was intermittent stream versus perennial. We're hoping that maybe that can shed some light on the issue. And then over time, we just sort of have to build a case and use the different analysis tools that we have to try and figure out whether there's going to be an impact.
Thank you.
But it's not easy.
I assume not, but thank you very much for your answer.
Chair, we have Denise.
Hi, this is Denise Crayley. Can you hear me?
We can, Denise, thank you.
Oh, great, thanks. So I'm calling in from Old Farm Road, which I'm not a civil engineer, I'm not a surveyor, but you know, from what I can tell from my backyard, I think we're higher up than the site in question. My abutter behind me, which would be, I believe, the Canton Ave extension, you know, has a lot of water in it. And I'm just in you know, piggybacking off what the prior resident had asked, and that was my exact question, is how the springs interconnect. You know, in the Indian Cliffs section of Milton, which is, you know, on a butter to this project, we have a road called Indian Spring Road. I have neighbors that are constantly pumping out their basements, it seems 24/7 as I'm walking now more due to COVID. So that's my exact question as well, is how they all interconnect and how that's going to impact this neighborhood, even though it seems to be higher up. I just don't know how it's going to affect it. And, you know, given that, and given the fact that Elm, Gulliver, Wendell Park have already expressed concerns, as they are, you know, already have a lot of water, it just adds fuel to the fire. And seeing what happened in Milton several years ago and the devastation that people had due to the flooding, whether it be in this neighborhood or in other neighborhoods, you know, Garden Street and so on and so forth. We have 23 family members in the town of Milton, immediate family members, and I think, you know, at least half of us had damage. The insurance that went up, the work that we had to do to make our properties whole just from that event was terrible. So, you know, having a project such as this and how it's going to impact everybody is, I'm glad it's being looked at so carefully. So I guess my question has to do with, you know, the springs in this neighborhood, you know, have they been looked at? Do they interconnect? That's my first question. My second question has to do with, again, not an expert. I'm an attorney, not a civil engineer, but, you know, I'm very concerned with rodents, with insects, with mosquitoes. When I hear standing water, when I hear bathtubs, when I hear, you know, stuff like that, it, you know, makes me cringe. So, you know, is something, are we looking at that at all? And, you know, how that could be mitigated if it does become a problem in terms of standing water? I guess that's my second question.
Would you like me to answer that, Mr. Chair?
Please, Mr. Ed.
So your first question is, no, I haven't looked at springs, and springs can really throw monkeys in the wrench because they, you know, they add a sort of a complexity to groundwater that sometimes is tough to analyze. So certainly that will complicate things and make an otherwise, you know, challenging situation even more so. I think on the mosquito side, one good thing about the project is that since there's not a lot of space in which to do surface detention, everything is below grade and enclosed. So likelihood that we're going to have standing water exposed is probably pretty remote.
Thank you, Mr. Ed. Beverly, anyone else?
Yes, we do. Schaefer? Oh, Schaefer, I'm sorry.
Could you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Bill Schaefer. I live at 648 Canton Avenue, rather 684 Canton Avenue, not to be confused with 648. I have been at this address for 52 years, and I could tell you several incidents in this neighborhood, such as perennial or intermittent running water. Next, between my property and the Repper's property, there is a running brook, and it runs 365 days a year. And for 52 years that I have been here, it has been constantly running. So I'm giving you firsthand advice on that. One of my biggest concerns about this property is the size. It is so huge for the egress and access to the property. In my years that I have been here on Mergewood Lane, Canton Avenue Extension, whatever you want to call it, there have been occasions during hurricanes or very windy storms where large trees have fallen down and people did not have access to the main highway until the trees were removed. And I have nightmares that possibly a tree could fall down on that property of 648 and there'd be no access for a fire truck to go in or an ambulance to go in. And it just doesn't meet the standards of our community. And I hope that you would take what I have to say in consideration. This afternoon, I was speaking to my neighbor across the street for Kelly's at 1 o'clock, and you should have seen the traffic there. We had a big to-do about traffic also. Now, Indian Spring, when I first came here, was the Cody Farm. And that was just an open farm area. There was no Indian Spring, but there's 170 homes there. There's many roads where people could go in and out. But with this road of one entrance to go in and one entrance to go out, just doesn't make sense for a whole development much larger than the Indian Spring. So I wish you'd take those things into consideration, and I thank you for listening for me.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Schaefer. This board will take into account all of the many issues that are being raised here. You can be certain of that. Beverly, anyone else?
Yes, we have Ms. Swenson.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Is my volume on? Can you hear me?
We
Okay.
can.
Okay, I'm sorry. So there is a safety matter that the planning board has witnessed over the years. And that is when piles of earth or debris or construction equipment are left on tree roots or other vegetation. When that happens, it suffocates the life out of the trees. And when you have a huge, let's say, beech tree, it might not die in the 6 months that the equipment is left on it. It may die a year after because it's a slow death of starvation. And the damage from compaction is just as bad. So if you have bobcats constantly running over tree root systems, you have the same thing. So we on the planning board have seen numerous beeches, oaks, and pines die that way. It's also a safety matter for the children in the area to have piles of debris and equipment just left, unintended after hours on the weekends or what have you. So those safety questions, I would love to see conditions, put into the plan. I do recommend fencing and markers so subcontractors don't, park their bobcats or leave their pipes or debris on the roots. You might walk by and think, oh, it's only temporary, but those piles of debris tend to get built upon, and it's astounding how out of control it can get. The Carberry Walcott site has some impressive fencing, and it really works. The subcontractors just know not to go in those places. And a site like Pulte, it looked like a bomb went off, and when you walked the site, you felt like you were walking on the moon. All the dry rubble, and so construction sites don't have to be like that. It just doesn't have to be that way. If you protect the trees and the vegetation that you can, it will help everything else. And so I will provide those rules and regulations and the language that we have learned to use in hopes that it's helpful for you. So a plan for equipment and a plan for protection is one of those.
Thank you.
We have one more. Chair.
Okay.
Lara Roche.
Hi, Mr. Reardon, can you hear me?
And yes.
Great. I do have a question for you. We touched on test pits and monitoring groundwater a bit, but in your expert advice, I guess, is there a number of test pits that you would recommend for this specific site based on the size of the lot? I think we said that there were, 6 test pits done for the size of the lot. Clearly, it seems as though that was not enough, but is there a standard of some sort to determine how many there actually should be? And then my second question is, what is the best way to monitor groundwater over the next 4 to 8 weeks when, it's certainly a wet time of the year? Is it through test pits? You said at a minimum test pits would do that, but is there something, more thorough, such as monitoring wells, or something that would get a better read for the neighborhood?
Sure. The first question about test pits and how many to do, and is there a standard that applies? There is a standard that applies to under the stormwater management standards that requires you, anytime you have an infiltrating stormwater feature, you need to have at least one test pit in the location of that infiltration feature. In this case, they haven't yet shown any infiltration features, but they may have to in order to demonstrate the standard. So they will at a minimum have to have test pits in those. Beyond that, it's really a function of how consistent the information is. So if you do, say, 2 more test pits in strategic corners of the site and they make perfect sense with the other test pits, then you probably have enough. But if you get really anomalous information from those 2 test pits, or you just can't figure things out based on the results that you're seeing, then you need to do a few more. So it really is dependent on a case-by-case basis. As far as groundwater, test pits are great for determining how high groundwater typically comes in a year. It only gives you one view of things. So you dig a hole one day and you fill it in the next. So you're really only going to observe groundwater at one time. So if you really want to understand kind of how groundwater is reacting in concert with other locations, the best thing to do is to, when you're backfilling that test pit, to just leave a perforated vertical pipe with some casing material around it so that you can sort of drop what's called a water level reader down and take some measurements. If you want to get real fancy, you can put a transducer down the bottom and have that send out information continuously. So there's all sorts of different mechanisms you can use, but the most basic information comes from a test pit. The highest level information comes from a well with a continuously reporting transducer.
And Mr. Reardon, seeing all the issues that were discussed tonight, do you think it would make sense to be extra fancy and set up monitoring wells that are going to give us an accurate read of what we're dealing with for groundwater?
If you were going to do that, it would have to be part of a plan. So what I wouldn't recommend doing is just going out and throwing in transducers at locations without a clear plan in place for why you're putting them there and what you're looking to compare them to. So just getting a bunch of information from one location probably isn't going to help you understand how things are working through the neighborhood, we'd have to have a plan to figure out, okay, what are we trying to determine here, and what's the best way to get good information, and then implement that plan. Right now, the big thing for me would be to get some test pits on other parts of the site, get us a better sense as to where that high groundwater table is running. So we know what kind of battles on the site that we're going to have to deal with constructing the facility as proposed. The important thing to remember here too is, given the proposed elevation of the site and some of the features, you're probably not going to be able to dewater the site by gravity, which means you're going to need a pump or some other mechanical means of lowering the groundwater table. That brings in all sorts of other issues, because if you're counting on a pump to keep water away from a storage vessel, or keep water away from loading a floor slab in a garage, then you got to have provisions in place to make sure those pumps are working all the time. And you know, it all goes to speaks to the complexity of this situation out there right now.
Thank you. And I have one additional question. So it was discussed at the site walk, I believe, and the applicant's representative had said that they would commit to doing more test pits. And then I think we discussed also last week that or 2 weeks ago, that there would be more test pits. How do we actually confirm that there will be more test pits and that they'll be taken in a timely fashion?
I don't have an answer for that question.
I think I can answer that best I can anyway. I mean, I think that will come up during the process. I mean, as I sort of began to lay out today, the way I see this unfolding is that we have the town representatives speak, we have the neighborhood representatives speak again, including experts that they are going to bring to the fore. And at the conclusion of that, after we've received all of that information, I think we turn to the developer and say, okay, you've heard all this. What do you propose? What are you willing to do? Are you going to restudy this? What commitments will you make? And I think it would be as part of that process that those kinds of things would be discussed. Required. That fully responds to your question. You know, at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of this stuff we're talking about really has to be done before we issue. I mean, before we issue any kind of a permit for this development, whatever configuration that permit might take. Obviously, you can have conditions in a permit itself that would apply going forward. But I think what you're talking about is how do we get that information and those sort of assurances as the process unfolds rather than after the fact. And so that will be part of the give and take between the board and the developer after we have all of this information. Say, okay, you've heard all this stuff, you know, how are you going to deal with this? How are you going to address this? What information are you going to give to us to allay some of these concerns? And that'll be part of that process. I hope that responds to your question.
Yeah, no, it did. Thank you very much. I think that, you know, speaking on behalf of multiple neighbors, I think it's just obviously a main concern, and knowing that we're getting into, you know, April, May, times that we would need these test pits done. I think that's why it keeps coming up, is because we'd like to see a commitment that these test pits would be done, so we get the information that we need.
I'm hoping in 2 or 3 weeks or so we'll finish. Well, maybe 4 weeks. We'll finish this phase. Hopefully, early May. And so that discussion can come up with the developer then. Well, I mean, the developer could come in at any time and tell us that they were going to do that on their own, but it will certainly come up at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
We have Denny Swenson again. Mrs. Swenson, I'm sorry.
Okay.
In preparation for the meeting tonight, I did drive through Farm Road, Canton Ave Extension, and Holmes Lane, and I did notice that I had some difficulty in my Honda trying to go past Robin O'Neill's home, as she mentioned, it's very narrow there, and with the slightest amount of construction, I can't imagine a fire truck being able to safely make that turn, as she had mentioned. It's actually rather impressive if you can see it in person, the difficulty that a fire truck would have on that road in its current condition. But that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Beverly, is that everyone?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Cheryl?
Yes, thank you. Cheryl Tagayas. Another question related to the soils and the possibility of rock. Do you advise, rather than test pits, that borings be done? Normally, a geotech report would be prepared for a project of this scale, which would take a look at the soils and the recommendation for foundation. I'm concerned that there will be rock and rock removal so close to existing properties, including historic homes such as Mrs. O'Neill's, could be very problematic for abutters. So would you suggest that soil borings be done on this site and a geotech report prepared?
Eventually, one will have to get done. Typically, borings in those type of reports are more for the structural design of the building, less for the civil engineering thing. So from a civil engineering standpoint, borings are the least illustrative of the mechanisms we have, because all it does is sort of document soil conditions. We can't see the soils, we can't see the groundwater. So we always prefer test pits are probably the best indicators of what's happening below the ground. But to answer your question, the building design will absolutely require boring and blow count testing, which is what the tools they use to determine how to do foundation designs and things like that. But those things are typically done more as a final design mechanism. The test pits are more illustrative of the groundwater and the conditions as far as we're concerned.
And have you seen, in your experience with projects and comprehensive permit projects, where geotech or borings have been done, given the proximity of this building to the property lines and to wetlands and historic resources? If this were soil, if these soils were unsuitable for a standard concrete foundation and needed piles, for example, or if you had rock removal, these could have pretty large impacts for direct abutters. And I'm just curious whether this is something that you've seen in your experience being requested at this juncture.
Not typically. I don't usually see a geotech report be requested at this time, knowing that building code would govern that, and that depending on the soil conditions they find, there's a wide range of design solutions that can be employed to deal with any particular situation, whether it's a deeper foundation or some other kind of footing design. So typically, we wouldn't require it, but I'd say it's probably a 50-50 shot that some developers would have a geotechnical report at this time, just for the purposes of due diligence. But it's not something that we would typically look for.
And my experience as an architect is that it would not be a large expense to have that done at this juncture and provide some assurances. Thank you, Mr. Reardon, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Kristen?
Hi, good evening. My name is Kristen Repa, and I am living at 654 Canton Avenue, which is, I guess we're referring to it as the Canton Avenue Junction. I would be, we are an abutter to, I guess not a direct abutter to 648, but I have more of a statement than a question, and I want to just say thank you to everybody for your patience with me. My family moved into this house over 40 years ago. And I just recently moved back here with my family. I'm fortunate enough to have done so. The purpose for my speaking out this evening is just simply to state that I'm neighbors with Bill Schaefer, who spoke just a little while ago. The intermittent stream wraps around our house, basically just comes in on the left-hand side and goes out on the right-hand side. And as a child, I remember it running all the time. As an adult now coming back, there was maybe a month where it was not watery. I'll say it like that. It definitely was not dry, but it was not watery. So I would definitely say that there is, without a doubt, water and wetlands here. And we, even closer to the house, have the sound of water running between rocks in our yard, let's say it like that. So definitely at times of the year there is more water than less water. And my only statement is that if in construction of the building, of course, I'll keep it short and say, of course, it's not something that I'm looking forward to, having neighbors that were not there before, to building out what has always been cherished by me as a very quiet area and lovely and serene. I guess the detail that I would just want to say that is through the construction, the disruption of the water would be something that is, though seems maybe like a nuisance to some people to have water so close to their house and something that they constantly have to pump out. I personally find it very serene and calming to constantly hear the water running through my backyard, and I appreciate that. To have something like 18 or 22 months of having a dried up water would be, dissatisfying if at the very least. So I just want to say like that I appreciate what the board is doing. I appreciate what all the details that my neighbors are bringing up, as well as the details that Mr. Reardon is bringing ahead of bringing up, and that's really it. Just that there is a fair amount of water that is right here constantly at the ground level, not even below the ground. I think that that's something strongly that should be considered, not just for the time after the building, but actually during the building. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken Roach?
Yes, hi, Kenny Roach at 44 Holmes Lane. Mr. Reardon, I just want one comment, number 21 in your letter there. With the proposed density, we recommend the applicant consider a looped water service connecting Canton Ave and Holmes Lane. Could you just elaborate on that and why that's suggested?
Yep. So when you have a project of this density, it's always nice to have two means of getting water to it. So if anything happened to one leg of the intersection or one leg of the service, you'd have another redundancy. In this case, there's a water main that runs up Holmes Lane that is also dead-ended. So if it happened to that line, the entirety of Holmes Lane would lose service. So what we thought would be a good idea is if you kept the service that came up the main road from Canton Ave along the main access road of the development, and then tied back over to where the existing service comes off of Holmes Lane, you reinforce both the project and the homes on Holmes Lane, providing all of those residents their redundant water service.
Thank you. That makes sense. So one other question for the applicant, if there was ever, I know it's early on, but if there was any looking into or flow tests on hydrants and whatnot to make sure the water pressure is sufficient for the fire suppression system that would be required for a building that size. And if not, what would be needed to get to the adequate water pressure that would be needed? Is it a fire pump being installed, etc.?
Corinne, is that a question within your purview?
Well, that's exactly why we have that section where we ask them to give us a technical memo on the water service and the sewer service, would be to address situations just like that. They do a fire flow test, compare the results of that to what the demands of their building are, deal with some quick modeling that determines the drop in pressure, they would basically provide a memo to the board that substantiates that there are no problems, or if there are problems, what their means of addressing them would be. So we would expect that to be addressed in that technical memo we requested in our comment letter.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Mr. Reardon.
Robin O'Neill?
Yes, Robin O'Neill again at 30 Holmes Lane. About the water issue. In the last 10 years, we've had 2 breaks in our water service. One at the bottom of the hill and one about halfway up our hill, which would tell me that particularly if there was any added pressure coming through here or more, improving it, we'd have to have the entire water service replaced. It was very old pipe. The town has patched it as best as they can. But again, within the last 10, the last one was within 5 years, 3 or 4 years. And the other one was farther down, almost to the bottom near Canton Avenue, where it's major having to rip up sections of the pipe to replace it. It's an old water line. And would that be a consideration if you were to tie in? I would be concerned that all that extra flow, I'm not a hydrologist or a water expert, but knowing that we've had 2 major issues, relatively recently, and who knows when the next one's going to happen because it's an old pipe. What would that mean, ripping up the lane again to put the new water service in? Because it comes right up the middle of the lane. Thank you.
Not knowing the specific condition of the pipe or the age of the pipe, not sure how to answer that, other than to say that a looped water main has less stresses than a dead end water main. So in some way, maybe in a modest way, but in some way that would relieve some of the stresses on your line. To your point though, if we're relying on having a redundant service and one of those legs of that service is old or in poor condition, we'd probably look for some repairs to that main to make sure that adequate supply is provided to the new.
Which would require ripping up the entire lane again. Because it runs right down the middle.
Yeah, or running a new one somewhere else. I don't know.
Thank you.
It looks like that's it.
Okay, great. Mr. Reardon, I want to thank you very much for.
Mr. Chair,
I'm sorry.
My hand, it's Ned Corcoran, my hand was up.
Ned, I don't see the hands. I want, there was a problem that came up last week and I guess I was reported to the authorities because I didn't get everyone. I don't see the hands. I have to rely on Beverly to tell me who's on there. I am not going anywhere. I'm happy to hear from anyone who wants to speak. So if they're brought to my attention, happy to hear from anybody. So if you want to speak,
that's fine. I
But
apologize.
I was not done with the attendees, and that's the only reason I had not answered. I had not responded to Ted.
Okay, go ahead.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. I have one question and maybe one comment. The question is that one of the overarching goals of the stormwater management standards is to require environmentally sensitive design and low impact development techniques in order to manage stormwater. Does this plan today go anywhere near achieving that requirement?
We haven't seen any low impact development techniques being used here.
Yes, it's 8:34. Let's go now.
And they may come in later as they address our questions, but as of yet, no.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, just a comment. We're coming into April and May. I know that the schedule runs out for several weeks and we will have an opportunity to address this board on April 13th, I think. But in the meantime, we're into the heavy wet season. And it seems to me it would be appropriate for the board to request the developer now to commit to performing additional water testing during this period of time so that you get an accurate depiction of what's the condition of the site relative to water.
Okay, that's something for us to consider. I know that Mr. Schomer is on my screen this evening. Is that something, Mr. Schomer, that you'd be prepared to address tonight?
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board, members of the public. our civil engineer, Jim Burke, is on the line, and if I may, I'll turn it over to him to respond to that question.
Okay, Mr. Burke, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank Mr. Reardon for such a thorough letter. Helps me out to make this design a little bit better. If I can just, I can just say this. I think the elephant in the room is how the soils and groundwater and surface water all kind of interrelate one another. I have a decent amount of experience on this hill. It is a tight till. And the surface water travels on that interface between the subsoil and the like. So that's why if you look at the test pits, you don't have any standing water in any of them. You have some weeps in the between the B and the C soils, and that's it. But I think some additional testing will alleviate a lot of concerns. Possibly some additional test pits witnessed by Mr. Reardon's firm will help out a ton. I think the only reason, again, and for the section 3 standard, the standard 3, and why we didn't propose any sort of infiltration is just because that soil is brutal. You can go all the way to Whittier, up to Wollaston Golf Club, to Highland Lane, and you're going to find that same stuff. You can certainly put a layer of stone in and let it sit there as far as infiltration goes. And I realize that the rate needed to meet that accommodation is small because that's what you're going to get. But if we can schedule up, and I agree, I think now's the time to do some soil testing while the wet season is here. You're going to be able to identify a dry bottom of a test pit, and you're going to identify high models due to surface water saturating the upper soil levels, and that's where you're going to get the groundwater falling into the hole of a test hole. So I guess, in a real quick manner, I'll just say that I'm ready to address a lot of the concerns raised by Mr. Reardon, and I see John Chessier online as well, and I'm sure he's got a list of things that I'll be looking forward to address as well. Not only mention Mr. Carpin's concerns as well. I'm confident that we can answer all these questions, and once we do some additional soil testing, the design itself that's out there right now will kind of bring to light the reasons why it's designed the way it is.
So Mr. Schomer, would it be agreeable to you if Mr. Reardon were to hook up with Mr. Burke over the next couple of weeks when it seems like it's the most appropriate time to do this kind of testing and do that while the opportunity presents itself?
If I may, I'd just like to go through it with my client tomorrow, get a schedule, get a methodology with regards to what I think needs to be done, and with him agreeing to what I think it needs to be done. And then I can coordinate with Mr. Reardon and get a timing down, and I'll make sure I call him and confirm this time.
Thank you.
And we'll get it done in short order.
Great. And Mr. Schomer, if you'd be kind enough, if you could just send the board sort of a brief little letter after you've talked to your client and you figure out what's going to be done, just telling us what's going to be done and when it's going to be done, that would be great.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. And if you'd like, perhaps at the start of next week's meeting, I can give a little update to.
That would be wonderful. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, Beverly, are we done? Hello? All right, I'm assuming that we are. This has been a.
Oh my gosh.
Mr. Chair,
I'm sorry. I was on mute again.
Okay.
Tim Sawinski, please.
Yes, Mr. Swinsky.
Thanks, Bev. Happens to the best of us. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify just on some of the comments that Ms. Swenson from the Planning Board made earlier. The bylaw, the cut and fill bylaw that she was referencing, hasn't been passed by town meeting yet. It's on the warrant for the May town meeting. It's been a subject of discussion by the Planning Board for quite some time. I think we're all very anxious for it to pass, but I just want to clarify that that's not actually a bylaw that's on the books right now. It's more of a kind of just a kind of technicality, because I think that the materials that Ms. Swenson is going to provide to you, and the sort of the insight into the Planning Board's kind of recent conversations about tree preservation and tree protection, it's all very good information. So it's whether or not the bylaws on the books right now is not relevant, because we're talking about waivers to the bylaws anyway. I think the subject matter of the information that she's going to provide to you is going to be very useful. But I just wanted to make that clarifying statement. And then also on the issue of the secondary emergency access.
Hello?
Tim?
We seem to
I
have
think I
lost.
lost my connection a little bit.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you now.
What I must have lost my connection there. What's the last thing that you heard me say there?
Holmes Lane.
Yes, Holmes Lane.
Just to clarify that, I have passed that issue along to the fire chief, and he'll have some comments when the town presents on April 6th. So
Okay.
he's looking at that issue, and I know there's also a kind of a legal question about access to Holmes Lane. I'll let the many attorneys in this meeting hash that one out, but he'll be able to speak to the safety issue and the ability of his trucks to get in and out.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Thank you.
Scott Wesley?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a comment and a question. I'm working with Ned Corcoran here, as you recall from the last hearing. First of all, Sean Reardon, great job, very comprehensive review. Thank you so much for all of your comments, and I think they were very clearly presented. So thank you for that. And just to reinforce one of the, as you said, major comments are the groundwater issues. Jim Burke, who just represented the applicant, described the soils in the site as brutal. And what that means is highly constrained. As Attorney Corcoran presented, the stormwater standard, which is a state requirement, requires environmentally site design and low impact development design, which calls for looking at the soils on the site and designing a project accordingly. According to the applicant's representative, the soils are brutal. According to the NRCS and the water levels, we have very shallow groundwater and low percolation. According to the town's peer review consultant, Sean Reardon, we have some major problems with groundwater issues. I just have to say, Mr. Chairman, to reinforce the need to get levels in April and May, which I think are going to show that not only is the project severely constrained, but I think as designed, it's unbuildable. And I would suggest that the suggestions by your peer review consultant, Mr. Reardon, who I highly respect, and others, and the applicant civil engineer at the last hearing who said they would be done, I would ask that this be confirmed tonight and not it be delayed so Mr. Burke can talk to the client and find out what they might want to do in the future. We're on the verge of April and May. And again, my input is that this is going to show some severe site constraints, which I think the town should be aware of in making any permit decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
I can certainly appreciate the abutters consultant to use my words against me. The reason I use the word brutal is because I have a lot of experience up there. The soils are tight, certainly. Unbuildable. I think you should get on site before you use words like that. So we will certainly do the soil testing. I already said we would. I want to find out, get a clear path for my client to figure out what methodology should be used. And we'll get back to the board in short time with that determination. Thank you.
That's fine, Mr. Burke.
We have one more attendee, Mrs. Swenson.
Okay.
I thank you. I wanted to thank Tim Cherwinski for his clarification, and I wanted to do one further clarification, and that is that the zoning bylaw section 4A is in full effect. Some of the tree language that I referred to is pending town meeting approval in May. So, but all the rules and regulations that I referred to are in full effect. So it's just some of the amendments that I referred to will hopefully be in effect in May.
Okay. We appreciate that clarification. Thank you. Okay, then I think we've probably finished for the evening. I think this is, at least for me, I'll only speak for myself on this, but this has been a very helpful session this evening. And Mr. Reardon, again, I want to thank you. I think your letter was really well done. It was written in a way that even I could understand, which is no mean feat. And I appreciate it. I really appreciate you bringing this to bear. I have a much better sense now of what some of the dynamics are with surface and groundwater at this site, and some of the problems that will have to be addressed in one form or another. So it's been a very helpful session of the public hearing for me. And I look forward to continuing this process next week. So having said that, Mr. Brown, Mr. Faber, anything you wanted to add?
I have nothing, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to all for your participation this evening, and look forward to hearing from some or all of you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody.
Good night.
Good evening.
Thank you.